Hey everybody, Heather here. Are you ready to color your April watercoloring card kit? This month we're going to be using the cute Humphrey stamp from Crafter's Companion. And the stamp comes with the cute little Humphrey, an accessory stamp with a little flower, and then 3 sentiment stamps. It is gray unmounted rubber, but I've tossed in the easy mount into your kit so you can just mount it and cut it out and get ready stamping. I've already stamped my image on Canson 140 pound Montvale watercolor paper. I have my medium and detail watercolor brush, my blue Wink of Stella glitter pen that I'm going to color with, and I have my Tim Holtz ink palette. And I've also got a nonstick craft mat so that I can color my glitter pen on here and use that to wipe up, and a paper towel to wipe my water brush. So let's get started. Alright, so I've got my water brush. I've tested it to make sure that it's wet enough so when I touch the paper towel I can see a little bit of water coming off of it. And then I've got my Wink of Stella blue glitter pen that I'm going to color with today. So I'm just going to scribble a little bit of that onto my nonstick craft mat. If you don't have a nonstick craft mat, you could use an acrylic block or a piece of acetate or a CD case or whatever you want to color on. And I'm just going to use my medium brush, and I'm going to pick up just a little bit of that color on the end of my brush. And I'm going to use that to color along the outside. I'm going to use that to make my sky. So I'm just going to put a little bit of my color down here next to my little Humphrey image. And I don't want it to dry, so I'm going to go back over it quickly with just water in my brush and kind of spread it out away from him. Okay, then I'm going to grab a little bit more, and I'm going to do the same thing up here. I'll just use a little bit of water here. As it runs out of ink, the water will be there to spread out. My brush is fairly wet too. You're going to want it to be pretty wet so that you can use the water to wipe the blue away from your image. Okay, and I'm going to do that all the way around. And the glitter pen, it has some glitter in there, so it makes it have some sparkles after it's dry. I turn my little guy around here. Grab me a little bit more of my blue. And if you don't have the glitter pen, you could also use Ranger's Tumbled Glass ink to add your blue to the outside. That makes a lovely sky color, and I ran out of ink, so I'm going to scribble a little bit more onto my nonstick craft mat and grab a little bit more. Just use that ink and bring it out here onto my paper. And you can add as much or as little as you like. I mean, you put it on pretty thick so it's pretty, makes a really dark blue line around him. You can let it dry and then come back and add a little bit more. You want it to be a lot more sparkly. The darker it is, I see that it seems to be more sparkly if it's the dark color. But it does, as you dilute it with the water, it still does have some blue sparkles in there. You can also use this pen to apply it directly onto your image. You just want to be quick because as soon as you put it down, it starts to dry, and you don't want it to be, you don't want it to dry really fast. So you need to put just a little area down and then come in with your water brush and spread it around, and then go to a new area and put a little bit more, and then continue wiping it with your water brush so it doesn't dry. Or you could do the little stripes on his pants here. That would be perfect. Just color it straight onto the image with that. So that looks pretty good for my outlining. I'm going to wipe up my little pile of ink there so I don't get my image in it. And then for my elephant, I'm going to color him with black soot. And for that, I'm going to grab a little bit of black soot on my brush. And I'm going to make a little spot here onto my craft mat. And then I'm going to take and squish my brush and let my brush get really wet. And make a little puddle. And I've diluted my ink in my puddle right here. Then we'll make sure to wipe your brush off. Don't use it with that much ink on there. So, and plus I let my brush drip, so I'm going to make sure to wipe it off pretty good because it's really wet now. So I'm going to wipe that off. And then to color my little image, I'm going to pick up a little bit of this diluted ink and apply it right next to the edge. I want to start where I want it to be darkest. So I want it to be darkest right next to his body. And then we'll go move to a new spot. And I want it to be darkest right on the back side of him this time. So I'm going to do over here first. And then I'm going to just let it run out of ink as I move my brush to this side of his arm. And then in between, I'm going to wipe the brush off, so I always grab new ink. And I'm going to wipe my brush off so I don't have quite so much on there. Maybe a little bit more. And we always let that dry before you add more on. So I'm going to let that dry for just a second. And then I'm going to take my little dot that I made over here on my craft mat. And I'm going to get a little bit more of my black soot out of my ink palette. And I'm going to add that right here. And then I'm going to take a little bit of my water and just dilute it a little bit more. But it should make it a little bit darker so that we can add some more highlights onto his body. So I'm going to pick up my second dot, pick up some ink out of my new dot, and I'm going to go over here where I want to start my shadowing. So I want it to be darker on the back. And see how much darker that is already than our first dot? And I'm just going to use water to tap it out. Lightly brush it over here to this side. And I want it to be a little bit darker right here where his arm kind of casts a shadow on his overalls. So I'll add a little bit more in there. And let's add some shading to his head up here. Add a little bit there. Wipe your brush off. And then use that ink you laid down to add color to his face. Maybe add a little bit right here where his trunk creases. And spread a little bit that up here towards the top. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry. And I'm going to go down here. I forgot to do his foot. So I'm going to grab a little bit of ink from my very first dot that I made. And I'm going to add a little bit onto his foot. Then I'll let that dry. And I'll come back and add some from my second dot that I made. And that looks pretty good. I think I'm going to leave him that color. I might come back later and add some more shadowing, but I think that's a pretty good gray color for him. And so from there, I'm going to move on to, he's got just this little patch of ear right here, so I'm going to add some color in that. So I'm going to switch to my detail brush so I can have a little bit smaller brush end. And I'm going to grab a little bit of tattered rose on the end of my brush. And I'm just going to, I'm going to start where I want it to be darkest, so it's going to be darkest right up here underneath the fold of his ear. And then I'm going to wipe the excess ink off my brush and just use the water to wipe down here onto the bottom of his ear and give it a little bit of pink in there. And I'm going to go back and add some more because that's not dark enough for me. And so while that is drying, let's go start with our overalls and add our first layer of ink to that. And so for that, I've used Barn Door. I'm going to grab a little bit of my Barn Door, and I want his overalls to be darkest on this side of his overall so they kind of lighten up as they go over here. So I'm going to start by laying my ink down on this side. And I'm just going to let it run out as it goes across to the other side of his overalls. Okay, I'm going to let that dry just for a second, and then we'll come and darken this side up and spread it more this way onto his overalls. But while that's drying, let's go up here and add a little bit of ink to his ear again. So I'm going to grab a little bit of tattered rose, and again, lay your brush down where you want it to be darkest. If you have too much ink, wipe it off. And I'm going to just use water to tap it out down here at the end so it's not quite so dark at the very tip of his ear. And then let's go back here and work on his overall some more. So let's grab some more Barn Door on our brush. And I'm going to start down here and lay down a little bit and just wipe it across like this. My brush, by the time it gets clear over here to this side of his overalls, is pretty much out of ink, but it's turning him a light pink color. And that's what we want because we can go back later and add some more color. Let's add a little bit more over here to the top of his little suspenders. You brush down and add a little bit of more light red to this side. And then let's also get the cuff of his pants. So let's do right here where they're touching. And I'm going to kind of skip this little rolled over part and add a little bit of ink to that when I've used up some more of my ink. So it's going to be a little bit lighter. I want the little rolled over part to be lighter than the rest. Oops, and it wasn't quite dry right here, so it's bled into this section. So let's wipe that up a little bit. Alright, so let's let that dry so that it doesn't bleed. And he's got a cute little flower up here. We're going to do the stem of the flower, and it's pretty small, so you just want to get a very small amount on the end of your brush. And for that I used peeled paint to color in the end of the stem. So I'm going to grab just a little ditty dab, and I'm just going to barely let the end of my brush touch the paper and just draw in that line because it's pretty small. And then for the center of the flower I used mustard seed, and since we haven't colored around that, let's go up there and get that. Colored that in with some mustard seed. And I didn't color the flower, I left it white, and I just added some stickles later on. And also his buttons here are going to be mustard seed as soon as we're finished playing with his overalls. So let's go in and add a little bit more color to our overalls. And so I'll grab me a little bit more of my fire brick. And his legs come together right here, and there's a little seam. So there's a little seam right here. So I want to darken up this little seam on this side. And right here where he's got a natural shadow line from on his pants. We'll just tap that out. So it's not quite so dark. I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow right above his belt line right here. And then I'll wipe my brush off. And I'll go in with just water and bring this line up a little bit. And since I've collected ink on my brush, I'm going to wipe it off again and then come back in with just the water on my brush and soften that line. Just like that. And let's go ahead and add a little bit more shadow right here underneath of his belt, right here. And down this little line, because that looks like it's going to be a crease in his pants. So again, wipe your brush off after you put down your ink. And if you get too much excess ink on your brush, go ahead and wipe it off again. And then come back and just soften it with just the water. Okay, and then we're going to give that a few seconds to dry, and we're going to come in and add some shadows. Alright, so to add some shadows to our little Humphrey here, I'm going to take some barn door, so I'm going to grab a little bit of that on my brush. I'm going to put it over here on my nonstick craft mat. And then I'm going to wipe my brush off. I don't want to dip my red into anything else. Wipe that off. And then I'm going to grab me just a little bit of black soot on the end of my brush. So I've got a little bit on there. And then I'm going to mix it in with this. Oops, and it looks like it got too much, so I'm going to wipe my brush off again. And just mix that around. Because I want to add just a little bit of darkness, but I don't want to turn it black. So there, that looks pretty good. So with that, I'm going to grab a little bit of that on the end of my brush. And so I want to add a little bit of shadow. So I want it to be darker over on this side of his outfit. Wipe my brush off and start over here. It's a little too wet. Grab me a little bit more ink. And then just lay down here where I want it to start to darken up. And I want it to be darkest on this side. And I can tell already I didn't put enough black in there because it's not doing much. So let's grab a little bit more. So I'm going to grab a little bit more of my barn door and add it to my spot right here. And then I'm going to pick up a little bit of my black and mix that in. So you get a little bit of color change there. And it's kind of trial and error. You have to try it out and see how it looks before you know for sure if that's the color you want. So let's try this. Let's grab a little bit of that on the end of the brush. Oh, there, that's a little bit darker. So I'm going to darken up this side of his little outfit with that. Grab down here on his cuff. And if you get too much ink, make sure to wipe your brush off on your paper towel. Because sometimes I pick up way too much ink on there and it's not lightening it out because it's got all that ink still sitting on your brush. Let's add some shadow in here to some of these little lines. Get up here on the top of this little suspender. Okay, so that looks pretty good, but I still want to darken up my shadows a little bit more. So I'm going to grab me a little bit more of my black soot on my brush, and I'm going to add it into my paint that I already have here onto my craft mat. Just just add a little dab. Just start with a little bit and then add more as you think you may need it. And sometimes I have to start over and just make more paint right from the beginning. So make sure I've dried my brush off enough so it's not too wet. And we'll grab a little bit of ink. And in between, I always wipe my brush off so that I'm not dragging more and more of that. Because the more you use your brush, the more it dilutes. And so I don't want it to be diluted too much over here. We're trying to add some shadows. So I'm going to wipe my brush off in between picking up ink. And then just use a little bit of water on my brush to kind of spread out my little shadow line I'm making. Give the roll of his cuff a little bit of shadow there. And get these little lines. Let's get underneath this one. Okay, that looks pretty good. I think I'm going to let that dry for a second. And then come back in and maybe add a layer of barn door over the top. So let's let that dry for a minute. Alright, so I let that dry for a minute, and then I'm going to come back in and I want to add a little bit of color to his little pocket here. So I'm going to grab just some barn door and add a little bit along the edge, and then I'm going to wipe off my excess ink and just use a little bit of water. Just spread this color up and add a little bit more color to his pocket. It's looking kind of white. I think I'll go down here and add a little bit more of just the barn door to his leg too. And you really do have to, with watercoloring, you really have to play with it. And, you know, it's not instant. You have to let it dry in between layers and come back and add some more shading in there. Maybe add some different colors to your paint. So maybe you didn't want to add black soot to your barn door for pants. You could add walnut stain and give it a brownish color. But get a scratch piece of watercolor paper and just practice and play. That's how I've done it. I just decide I'm going to add a little bit of color, and I'm like, oh, well, let's try these two together and see how those look. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add some color to this grass. And for that, I used peeled paint. So I'm going to go down, and I'm going to start underneath of his feet because I want it to be the darkest underneath where his feet are shadowing. And then as I get out here to the edge, it'll be a lot lighter. And peeled paint, if you play with it too much, it's got kind of a yellowish, brownish cast to it. It will change colors. So I try not to mess with it too much. I'll lay it down and then go over it one or two times a little bit. But I don't really mess with it too much because I don't want it to turn that distressed ink color. I want it to be green. And then if you let this dry and you want it to be darker underneath of him, you'll go back and add some more in there. But let's go up here, since his pants are all dry, let's go up and add some mustard seed to those little buttons he's got on his overalls. So just go in with some mustard seed and just dab it right onto his button. And you can make these darker by letting it dry and then go back in and add some more color on top of that. And I think I'm going to do that down here with the grass. Make it a little bit darker underneath of his feet still. But that's our watercoloring card for this month. It's not that hard. I just wanted to be able to try out this new Zig Wink of Stella glitter pen and give you all a chance to give that a try. It is really fun. Like I said, you know, practice a little bit on a piece of scratch paper first if you want to. And I do have another how-to video on just the Wink of Stella pen, so you could watch that and see a few different things with that. But this is our card this month. And he's really cute. So that's it for today. I hope you had a great time, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.